Every life has a story. Some are told, others wait to be revealed. Stay with us. This is Daily Dose.
What happens to a family when the people in charge decide that loyalty has an expiration date, and that love alone is no longer enough to keep you inside the walls you were born behind? That question might sound like something from a novel, something dramatic and distant, but it is the question now hanging over the British monarchy in a way that feels deeply personal, deeply human, and deeply final. Because what has unfolded in recent months between Prince William, King Charles, Princess Anne, and Prince Harry is not simply a disagreement between brothers or a policy shift within an institution. It is the slow, deliberate, and methodical severing of a bond that was once considered unbreakable. And the weight of it, the sheer gravity of what it means for the future of the crown, for two young children caught in the middle, and for a man who once stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace as one of the most beloved figures in the world, is something that deserves to be understood fully, not in headlines, not in sound bites, but in the full scope of its emotional and institutional consequence. Welcome to Daily Dose, and this is a story that begins not with anger, but with silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when everyone already knows what is about to be said and no one wants to be the first to say it. It reportedly started at Windsor Castle. A formal declaration, issued from within the historic walls of St. George's Hall, delivered by Prince William in what has been described as his capacity within a provisional royal council framework. The message was direct. The preservation of the crown, William is said to have stated, demands more than legacy. It demands discipline. And with those words, the future king of the United Kingdom signaled something that many had suspected but few believed would ever be spoken aloud. The era of quiet toleration, the decades-long tradition of shielding errant royals from public consequence, was over. Not gradually, not partially, completely. Standing alongside Princess Anne, Duchess Sophie, and senior members of the Privy Council, William reportedly invoked the controversial decision made by King Charles months earlier, the removal of Prince Andrew from Royal Lodge and the stripping of all his remaining titles. That decision, which had itself sent shockwaves through the establishment, was now being cited not as an isolated act of discipline, but as the foundation for an entirely new doctrine. A doctrine that would reach further than anyone had anticipated. A doctrine that would touch not just one disgraced uncle, but a brother, a sister-in-law, and two young children who had never asked to be part of any of it. What followed was not a single decision, but a cascade of them, each one building on the last, each one more permanent than the one before. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, was to be permanently barred from any return to working royal status. All royal insignia, heraldry, and estates associated with his lineage were to be frozen pending further review. The styling of His Royal Highness, for both Harry and Meghan Markle, was to be revoked in perpetuity and would no longer be recognized in any official capacity. And perhaps most strikingly, a safeguard clause was introduced concerning the couple's two children, Archie and Lilibet, placing them under a form of protective institutional watch, with provisions that in certain extreme circumstances, guardianship could pass to Princess Catherine and Duchess Sophie, acting jointly in what was described as a royal matron capacity. The language was formal, the intent was unmistakable, and the message to the world was clear. The House of Windsor was no longer willing to wait, to hope, to negotiate. It was acting, decisively and permanently. Now, to understand why this moment carries the weight it does, you have to understand the precedent that made it possible. Because none of this happened in a vacuum. The groundwork was laid months earlier, when King Charles made the deeply controversial decision to remove Prince Andrew from Royal Lodge and strip him of all remaining titles and privileges. That decision, described by the palace as a non-negotiable transition, was remarkable not just for what it did, but for what it symbolized. Charles had overruled what many believed to be one of the late Queen Elizabeth's most sacred final wishes, that Andrew be allowed to live out his remaining years in quiet dignity. Charles chose the institution over the individual. He chose the future over the past. And in doing so, he created a template, a legal and moral precedent that Prince William would later seize upon with extraordinary precision. The significance of that choice cannot be overstated. For decades, the British monarchy had operated under an unspoken agreement. Family members who embarrassed the crown would be quietly sidelined, given reduced roles, moved to smaller residences, allowed to fade from public view without the indignity of formal punishment. It was a system built on discretion, on the belief that the family's private pain should never become the nation's public spectacle. Queen Elizabeth had perfected this approach. She had weathered scandals, divorces, tell-all interviews, and tabloid wars by simply refusing to engage, by letting time and silence do the work that confrontation never could. But Charles saw something his mother had not, or perhaps something she had seen but chosen to ignore. He saw that silence, over time, had become permission. That discretion had become complicity. That the public, once willing to look the other way, now demanded transparency and accountability from the very institution that asked for their loyalty and their taxes. The removal of Andrew was not just a punishment. It was a statement, a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. And it was that statement, that willingness to act against blood, that gave William the authority to do what came next. William reportedly framed it plainly during the council proceedings. If the law could not shield Andrew, then principle would not shield Harry. This was not vengeance, he is said to have stated. This was stewardship. And whether you agree with that framing or not, the logic was internally consistent. The same standard that brought down one royal uncle was now being applied to a royal brother. The monarchy was no longer making exceptions based on bloodline. It was making decisions based on conduct. And conduct, in the eyes of the new Windsor leadership, was the only currency that still mattered. Behind the scenes, the machinery of this transformation was meticulous and exhaustive. A legal report, described as running well over 100 pages, was reportedly presented to the council by Lady Louise Windsor, who had taken on an increasingly prominent role as a kind of internal auditor for the royal household. The document is said to have detailed a range of alarming findings: inconsistencies in the national registration of Archie and Lilibet, attempts to commercially license the children's names and images without royal authorization, and the alleged dissolution of an education trust fund that had been set aside for the children's future and reportedly reallocated to private projects. The report, compiled by a team that reportedly included royal barristers, forensic analysts, and medical consultants, painted a picture not of malice necessarily, but of systemic incompleteness, a fog of administrative ambiguity surrounding two children who, by birth, were part of one of the most documented family lines in human history. Neither child, according to the findings, possessed documentation that fully satisfied the protocols of the Royal Lineage Registry. Multiple prior statements issued regarding the children's titles, place of birth, and schooling contained inconsistencies that rendered the line of succession and custodial jurisdiction what the report termed administratively ambiguous. Princess Anne, who has long been regarded as the most no-nonsense member of the royal family, reportedly addressed this directly during the proceedings. The late Queen, Anne is said to have stated, made it clear that family comes with duty and duty with traceability. The fog surrounding the children, she continued, is not their fault, but it is our obligation to clear it. Those words, restrained but pointed, captured the tone of the entire proceeding. This was not a family lashing out in anger. This was an institution asserting control over its own narrative, its own legacy, and its own future. And Anne, with her characteristic bluntness, was making it clear that sentimentality would not be allowed to cloud the process. The council proceedings themselves were described as taking place behind reinforced oak doors in the Waterloo Chamber at Windsor Castle. Only a handful of senior royal members, constitutional advisors, and Privy Council dignitaries were present. King Charles did not attend in person, but had reportedly dispatched a sealed communication the evening before bearing his sovereign stamp. The presence of Princess Catherine at the council, despite not holding a formal constitutional role, was noted by multiple sources as deeply significant. Her symbolic role in the family's integrity, it seemed, had become inseparable from its decision-making core. Catherine was no longer simply the wife of the future king. She was a pillar of the institution itself, a quiet but immovable force whose presence communicated resolve without the need for words. And then came the vote. The council reportedly passed a binding recommendation with unanimous support, a recommendation that would become a formal decree. The provisions were sweeping. Prince Harry was to be permanently excluded from any future line of representation, security funding, or legal affiliation with the royal household. The diplomatic title styling for Archie and Lilibet was to be revoked in international correspondence. A royal custodial panel was to be installed under the sovereign's family office to oversee the children's welfare until full legal clarity could be established. And British embassies were reportedly instructed to cease recognition of the children as royal descendants until what was termed documentary remediation had occurred. The speed of it was breathtaking, but the emotional undercurrent was even more striking, because buried within all the legal language and institutional maneuvering was a deeply human moment that has stayed with everyone who learned of it. Prince Harry, according to sources, received word of the decree through a private phone call from his uncle, Prince Edward. The call reportedly lasted just 4 minutes. Harry, it was said, did not yell. He did not rage. He wept, and then he asked a single question: what happens to the children now? That question, quiet and broken, is perhaps the most important detail in this entire story, because it reveals something that the headlines often miss. Behind the titles and the tabloids and the transatlantic drama, there is a father. A father who, whatever his mistakes, whatever his choices, whatever bridges he has burned, is watching the walls close in around the only thing that still connects him to the family he was born into: his children. He did not ask about his own status. He did not ask about his titles or his security or his future role. He asked about Archie and Lilibet. And in that question, you can hear something that no decree can fully address: the sound of a man realizing that the consequences of his decisions have reached the people he was trying to protect. Reports suggest that Harry did not object to the terms of the decree. He reportedly asked only for a copy of the dossier and permission to write a private letter to William. That permission was granted. What the letter contained remains unknown. But the fact that he asked to write it, that in the midst of institutional exile he reached for a pen rather than a microphone, suggests something that the public narrative often overlooks. Harry, for all his public missteps, may still be searching for a way back, not to the balcony, not to the titles, but to his brother. Here at Daily Dose, we try to hold space for that complexity, because the truth is rarely as clean as a decree or a press release. The truth lives in the silence between the words, in the pause before a man asks what will happen to his kids, in the space between a brother's letter and the response that may never come. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Meghan Markle's legal team moved swiftly and aggressively. In what was described as a closed-door emergency, filing at a family court in California, Meghan reportedly petitioned for emergency jurisdictional protection, a legal motion designed to block any foreign interference in the custodial designation of Archie and Lilibet. The argument was straightforward on its surface. The children had been raised on American soil, under American law, and under Meghan's primary care. They were, her attorneys argued, subject solely to California family law. The petition reportedly characterized the royal decree as a hostile act against maternal stability and accused the United Kingdom of sovereign overreach, a phrase that carried enormous legal and diplomatic weight. The filing opened up a jurisdictional battleground that legal experts described as virtually unprecedented. On one side, a 1,000-year-old monarchy asserting its institutional rights over children born into its lineage. On the other, a mother invoking the protections of American family law to shield her children from what she characterized as foreign interference. The clash was not merely legal. It was philosophical. It was a collision between two fundamentally different ideas about what family means, what authority looks like, and who gets to decide the future of two children caught between two worlds. Royal observers were quick to note the irony embedded in Meghan's position. For years, she had invoked royal titles and connections to advance public causes and personal branding. The Sussex name, the royal crest, the proximity to the crown, all of it had been leveraged in ways that the palace had grown increasingly uncomfortable with. Now, as those ties were being formally severed, she was invoking American sovereignty to reject them. The duality of that position, wanting the prestige of the crown without its obligations, wanting the freedom of distance without the consequences of departure, has been at the heart of the Sussex story from the very beginning. And it is a duality that the monarchy, under William's leadership, appeared no longer willing to tolerate or accommodate. But the legal battle was only one front in a much larger war. Reports emerged that a private investigator had allegedly been retained by Meghan's team to begin collecting character files, presumably to preemptively discredit any royal-appointed guardian or oversight figure. Non-disclosure agreements were reportedly being drafted. Lawyers were being quietly retained on both sides of the Atlantic. The machinery of conflict, once hidden behind palace walls and publicist statements, was now grinding into full, visible motion. And then came the surprises that no one saw coming. In a move that stunned even the most seasoned royal commentators, Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, publicly backed William's position. In a letter that was reportedly published through her own literary agent rather than the royal press office, a deliberate signal of independence, Ferguson wrote that firmness is not cruelty and that the family desperately needed clarity. She went further, stating that for years the palace had been a maze of silence and contradiction, and that she applauded the king and the prince for refusing to allow future generations to inherit past mistakes. The monarchy, she wrote, must be firm because the people need to believe in something that will not flinch. The significance of Ferguson's statement cannot be overstated. Here was a woman who had herself been on the margins of the royal family for decades, who had been closely associated with Prince Andrew through various post-divorce endeavors, who had experienced the sting of institutional rejection and public humiliation, now siding publicly and unequivocally with the very forces that were drawing the hardest lines the monarchy had ever drawn. Her words were being privately circulated within the palace as what some described as the clearest outside validation of William's strategy. Some interpreted it as a moral repositioning, a woman who had learned from her own exile and now recognized the necessity of boundaries. Others saw it as a warning, a signal that even those who had once been sympathetic to the Sussex cause now recognized that the tide had turned irreversibly and that aligning with the losing side carried its own risks. And then came the most explosive moment of all. Prince Harry, in what was described as a surprise live-streamed statement, reportedly made a series of stunning allegations that sent shockwaves through both the royal establishment and the global media. He accused Meghan of having shown him falsified documents related to Archie's original birth registration. He further alleged that Prince Andrew had facilitated confidential meetings between Meghan and overseas security advisors during a period when Andrew himself was under intense scrutiny. The claims, if true, would represent a staggering web of deception that stretched across continents and years and implicated people on multiple sides of the family divide. Harry's words, as reported, were raw and unguarded. This goes beyond betrayal, he is said to have stated. I was misled not only by my wife, but by a man this family already knew could not be trusted. The statement was remarkable not just for its content, but for its target. Harry was not attacking William or Charles or the institution. He was turning on the two people who, in different ways, had been his closest allies in the years since he left the royal fold. It was the kind of statement that burns every bridge simultaneously, that leaves a person standing alone in the wreckage of every relationship they once depended on. The palace's response was measured but telling. Rather than dismissing the allegations or rushing to contain them, William reportedly leaned into the moment with a composure that surprised even his own advisors. Let the court examine everything, he is said to have remarked. Even if the allegations come from a prince in distress, they must be heard in the interest of truth and stability. Let us show the world that justice begins at home, even in a palace. That response, calm and deliberate, captured the essence of what William appears to be building. Not a monarchy of retribution, but a monarchy of accountability. a monarchy that does not flinch from uncomfortable truths, even when those truths come from within its own bloodline, even when they are delivered by a man whose credibility has been questioned, whose motives are unclear, and whose emotional state is visibly fragile. The shift from behind-the-scenes management to formal, structured, institutional judgment represents perhaps the most significant evolution in royal governance in living memory. For centuries, the monarchy had dealt with its internal crises through whispers, through quiet arrangements, through the strategic deployment of silence. Now, under William's emerging leadership, the institution was choosing transparency over discretion, accountability over comfort, and formal process over family feeling. Whether that shift represents progress or a loss of something essential, something human and forgiving that once lived at the heart of the Windsor family, is a question that history will have to answer. And at the center of it all, always at the center, two children, Archie and Lilibet. Children who did not ask to be born into a tidal war. Children whose faces have been used on magazine covers and streaming platforms, whose names have been attached to commercial ventures and legal disputes, whose very identities have become contested territory in a battle between two continents, two legal systems, and two fundamentally incompatible visions of what it means to be royal. They are the silent figures in this story, the ones whose voices are never heard, whose preferences are never consulted, whose futures are being decided in courtrooms and council chambers by adults who claim to be acting in their best interest. The formal severance, when it came, was delivered with the kind of cold precision that only an institution with 1,000 years of practice can achieve. Princess Anne stood beside a ceremonial desk at Buckingham Palace, flanked by the official royal insignia and Privy Council scrolls. Her expression was described as steely, her voice unwavering. The language she used was surgical. For the protection of the crown, the future of the realm, and the emotional integrity of two children born into conflicting loyalties, she reportedly stated, "We hereby finalize the institutional withdrawal of rights, roles, protections, and recognition from Mr. Harry Mountbatten Windsor and Mrs. Meghan Markle." The use of civilian titles was not accidental. It was not a slip of the tongue or a bureaucratic oversight. It was the final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been years in the writing. By referring to Harry and Meghan as Mr. and Mrs., the palace was underscoring in the most public and permanent way possible that all formal honorifics had been terminated. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex no longer existed in any official capacity. The people who had once been among the most famous royals in the world were now, in the eyes of the British Crown, private citizens with no more claim to the institution than any other subject of the realm. The Royal Gazette reportedly published a supplemental notice shortly after the announcement, detailing the revocation of the children's royal styling under what was described as the Sovereign Grant Code. The revocation was applied retroactively, dating back to the period when Harry and Meghan had formally stepped down from senior royal duties. The implications were enormous. Archie and Lilibet would be permitted to retain dual citizenship status, but would be recognized only under their maternal surname in official UK documentation. Their participation in any royal-adjacent events, even as private citizens, would reportedly require approval from the Lord Chamberlain's office. And a protective injunction was described as having been granted to prohibit the unauthorized commercial use of their images in conjunction with former royal titles. Legal experts quickly noted the breadth and ambition of this provision, calling it a preemptive measure against future exploitation, whether through streaming deals, memoirs, merchandising, or any other commercial venture that sought to trade on the children's royal connection. The provision was designed not just to address what had already happened, but to prevent what might happen next. It was forward-looking in a way that suggested the palace had studied Meghan's business strategies carefully and was determined to close every door before it could be opened. The response from Meghan's legal team was swift and furious. A press release was issued calling the decision an act of dynastic cruelty and warning of a forthcoming challenge through international human rights channels. The language was deliberately provocative, designed to reframe the narrative from one of institutional discipline to one of maternal persecution. But senior royal aides had reportedly anticipated this move, quietly submitting preemptive evidence of what they described as repeated violations of agreed-upon protocols, including commercial activities that had leveraged the children's royal connection without authorization. The legal battle that was now taking shape had all the hallmarks of a conflict that would stretch on for months, perhaps years. On one side, the full weight of the British monarchy, backed by centuries of precedent, constitutional authority, and the resources of the sovereign's legal office. On the other, a determined mother with access to American courts, a team of aggressive attorneys, and a media platform that had proven remarkably effective at shaping public opinion. The battleground was not just legal but cultural, a clash between Old World authority and New World individualism, between institutional duty and personal freedom, between the idea that children belong to their parents and the idea that royal children belong, in some fundamental sense, to the crown. Here at Daily Dose, we have followed this story not because it is sensational, but because it is profoundly human. It is the story of a family that chose institution over individual, of a brother who chose the crown over his sibling, of a father who may have chosen his children's future over his own place in their lives. It is a story about what happens when the walls you were born inside become the walls that keep you out. And it is a story that, despite all the legal language and formal decrees, ultimately comes down to the simplest and most painful of human questions. What do we owe the people we love? And what do we do when that love is no longer enough to hold everything together? Prince Harry, through it all, remained largely silent in the days following the formal severance. Reports suggested he had moved to a private residence in the English countryside, far from the cameras and the chaos of Montecito, far from the legal filings and the press releases, far from everything that had defined his life for the past several years. Sources close to him described a man who was emotionally torn, increasingly reflective, and grappling with the full weight of what his choices had cost him. One account suggested he had privately expressed willingness to relinquish all paternal claims in exchange for future access rights under palace supervision. If true, it would represent not an act of betrayal or weakness, but an act of quiet, devastating surrender. A father choosing his children's stability over his own presence in their lives, choosing their peace over his proximity. There is something almost unbearably sad about that image. A man who once walked behind his mother's coffin as the world watched, who served in combat zones, who married in a ceremony seen by billions, who stood on the steps of a hospital holding his firstborn son, now sitting alone in a rented house in the English countryside, contemplating whether the best thing he can do for his children is to step away from them entirely. Whether you believe Harry brought this upon himself, or whether you believe he was failed by the very institution that now seeks to erase him, that image carries a weight that no legal decree can fully capture. Princess Catherine, when asked about the final severance by a reporter as she left a Sunday service with her children, reportedly offered a brief but telling response. There are moments in a family's life, she is said to have stated, where truth must be chosen over comfort. This was one of them. Those words, simple and unadorned, carried the weight of everything that had come before. The years of tabloid warfare, the opera interview, the Netflix series, the memoir, the lawsuits, the silence. The distance, the birthday calls that were never made, the christenings that were never attended, the holidays spent on opposite sides of an ocean, all of it distilled into a single, quiet acknowledgement that some fractures cannot be repaired, only managed. Only survived. Catherine's composure throughout the entire process had been noted by virtually every observer. She had said little in public, issued no dramatic statements, made no grand gestures. Yet her presence at every key moment, her quiet influence behind closed doors, her insistence on including child welfare experts in the proceedings, all of it pointed to a woman who understood that the real stakes of this conflict were not titles or money or public image. The real stakes were two children who needed anyone, to remember that they were not symbols or bargaining chips or brand assets. They were kids, and kids need stability more than they need crowns. Outside the palace gates on the day of the formal announcement, a small crowd gathered. There was no anger, no celebration, no chanting or sign waving. just a somber recognition that something fundamental had changed, something that could not be unchanged. One woman held a sign that read, according to reports, "Windsor does not mean titles. It means duty." And in that simple sentence, the entire philosophy of the new monarchy was captured. Not a family defined by blood, but a family defined by commitment. Not a legacy inherited, but a legacy earned. Not a birthright that protects you from consequence, but a responsibility that demands you face it. The monarchy that emerged from this crisis was leaner, harder, and more deliberate than the one that had entered it. The old Windsor way, the way of silence and patience and quiet endurance, had been replaced by something sharper. Whether that sharpness represents strength or brittleness, whether it will serve the institution well in the decades to come or whether it will create new fractures even as it seals old ones, remains to be seen. Institutions that survive by cutting away their own members may find that they have purchased stability at the cost of warmth, that the walls they have fortified are strong but cold, that the legacy they have protected is intact but hollow. And perhaps that is the question that will define the next chapter of this story. Not whether William was right or Harry was wrong. Not whether Meghan was a villain or a victim. Not whether Charles was brave or cruel. But whether a family that has chosen order over forgiveness, discipline over grace, institution over individual, can still call itself a family at all. Whether the crown, having survived this crisis, will find that it has lost something it cannot replace. Whether the children at the center of it all, Archie and Lilibet, will one day look back at this moment and understand why the adults in their lives made the choices they made. Or whether they will simply feel the absence, the way children always do, without fully understanding its cause. The royal line has been redrawn. The institution has been fortified. The children, whatever comes next, have been placed under the protection of a system that has decided, rightly or wrongly, that their future matters more than their parents' pride. And the monarchy, for better or worse, has shown the world that it is willing to cut deep in order to survive. But survival is not the same as healing. And a family that chooses discipline over grace may find that the order it creates is colder than the chaos it replaced. So perhaps the question is not whether the monarchy made the right decision. Perhaps the question is simpler than that, and far more difficult to answer. When a family decides that one of its own no longer belongs, when the doors close and the titles fall away and the silence settles in, who exactly is left standing inside those walls, and what kind of home have they made?
If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to know. The truth continues tomorrow. Until then, this was your daily dose